right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to be here to share some of the key takeaways from the 2022 British Columbia budget. Today's presentation is not going to dive into details to the degree that you might want to specifically for your industry, but the purpose is to give a concise 30-minute overview of what I believe are some of the key takeaways so that you can have a high-level understanding of what the province's state of financial affairs is. And also for registered attendees, you'll receive an email later today with a copy of the presentation, a summary document, and then a link to recording of the session. If you have any questions during this session, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat and I'll try to get to as many as possible. And if you have questions following, send me an email and I will try and answer them as best I can. So thank you so much for being here today. All right, for those of you who don't know, my name is Melissa Cowett. I was born and raised in Alberta, but I moved to Vancouver last year. I started my own public policy practice and I help clients with strategic advice, government relations, and research and analysis work. Previously, I've worked as a political staffer in Alberta. I've helped out on countless campaigns at the municipal, provincial, and federal level in Western Canada, and as a public policy consultant at an international law firm and several Canadian consulting firms. If you're interested in getting to know me and what I do better, please don't hesitate to reach out after, and I'd love to discuss how we might be able to work together. So without further delay, let's unpack Budget 2022. So here's a picture of the budget that was tabled yesterday by Minister Selina Robertson. It is titled Stronger Together, which overviews a lot of the key themes that we're going to see today in the budget. So lots of talk about clean and sustainable growth, a lot of the same pandemic language that we've seen in terms of being together and working as a team to get through tough times. A few things to note before we jump into the actual details. Last week, Premier Morgan and Minister Calon released the Stronger BC Economic Plan, which a lot of things that are discussed in this budget were built off of releases in that plan. So we'll talk a bit about that. And then interesting enough as well, the government has made a bit of an amendment to the Balanced Budget and Ministerial Accountability Act, which means that cabinet ministers will continue to keep their wages instead of the 10% cut that they would get under the act for running deficits. Ministers are still going to be responsible to keep accountability over their line items, though. All right, so budgets provide a really excellent opportunity for governments to both look forward in terms of what is the new spending going to be, but also a really important opportunity to look backward as well. And so that's why we're going to start today by talking about what Budget 2022 revealed about the state of affairs for fiscal year 2021-22. So when we look at these numbers, we can judge how the government performed and how their initiatives affected the economy. But I would just say, given the fact that we are still in a post-pandemic state, a lot of these numbers are a lot different than they would probably be normally, and I'll nuance that as well as we talk about it. So the biggest news out of yesterday is that the budget's deficit is significantly lower than the $9.7 billion projected in budget 2021. So the deficit came in at $483 million, which is billions of dollars less. So that is a huge improvement. A lot of that is attributed to really strong resource revenue prices in the past few months, which have really contributed to the bottom line, as well as an insane level of property transfer tax revenue. So that was $3.25 billion, which is significantly more than was expected. This has to do with lots of home buying activity because it's a tax that people pay when they purchase homes. So that suggests that correlates with the fact that home sales were up about 30%. So we probably won't see that hold strong. A lot of people were moving to more space, et cetera, during the pandemic. So that was an area that was affected there. As well, ICBC revenues were extremely high. This is partly due to a move to the no-fault system, as well as people just not driving and being in their normal lives as much. And then as well, investment income. One of the things I'll draw your attention to here as well is the taxpayer supported debt, which is at $61.7 billion for 2021-22. This is a common theme that we're seeing in provinces and at the federal government as well in terms of how we look at taxpayer supported debt. So there's the old adage was often to avoid debt, and now it's really to keep that taxpayer supported debt to GDP ratio under a manageable amount. For the federal government, that's under 30%. Other provinces is 30%. BC has said under 25% is acceptable, and they're at 17.8 for last year. So that's within what their expectations were. As well, economic growth at 5% is quite good, which goes to show that the pandemic recovery for BC is going quite well. We don't expect that to hold for next year, but it'll still be positive and in the right direction. Here's what Budget 2022 projects. So this is what the government is projecting for next year. So starting on April 1st. So fiscal year 2022, 2023. This is what they expect to see. And so that's a really important point to remember for budgets, is that they are forward-looking expectations. They can change, as we saw last year. They did. One of the things I'll draw your attention to is the $5.5 billion deficit. We'll talk about this a bit more, but that the deficits that the NDP government will have over the next 3 years are due largely to investments they're making in infrastructure spending. And again, we have the taxpayer-supported debt to GDP ratio at a manageable amount. And so that's not too much of a concern for this government. People can have different perceptions about whether that's something governments should be doing or not. But for the purposes of the budget, it is right where they want it to be. You'll see as well, ICBC revenues and natural resource revenue are significantly lower than for this year. Again, they're not projecting that natural resource revenues are going to be as high as they are right now. And of course, as we return to normal life, ICBC will return to normal activity as well. Economic growth, as I said, a bit less, but still growing. So not as heavy as it was this year, but still a really good amount. All right, so before we get into talking about some of the key themes of the budget, tax changes that you should be aware of. So there wasn't anything major in terms of huge increases to corporate tax or personal income tax or anything like that. But there were some things that are going to affect businesses and just affordability, generally speaking, and we'll talk a bit about that. So the first one is the $5 per ton increase in the carbon tax. That is not new. That is something that has happened every year for the past few years. It's a planned increase to the carbon pricing that will go up by $5 a ton. Interestingly enough, that amounts to that 5.2% increase amounts to about a 1% increase in liter on gas. So that will affect affordability for folks in terms of their bottom line. Not a lot, but significant. They are also introducing PST requirements for marketplace facilitators. So folks who are selling services or goods online may be subject to both paying PST and remitting PST. So that's a significant introduction, as well as the PST exemption for tobacco products will be removed as of July 1st. We also see some other focuses here in terms of a hydrogen exemption for the motor fuel tax extended. So that is really to incentivize the use of and development of hydrogen fuel cells, which is something that the government is really focused on. We get in as well to a lot of spending for Clean BC, and that includes some tax implications as well. They introduced notably a clean buildings tax credits for people who want to put retrofits on their building to make them more energy efficient. They are also expanding the PST exemption for zero emissions vehicles, and then also putting in an exemption for heat pumps and increasing the tax rate on fossil fuel combustion systems. So those are some of the key changes that they have introduced that will represent a bit of a shift in terms of taxes for British Columbians. All right, so now we get into the key themes of the budget. Again, we're not going to go into a deep discussion ministry by ministry, line item by line item, but after reading the budget and after reading the coverage on it and comparing to what we've seen in the political sphere as well, these are the key themes that I think budget 2022 encompasses. You'll see recovery, climate, reconciliation, infrastructure, and affordability. Interestingly enough, while there are supports for pandemic recovery, healthcare spending I would not rate as one of the top issues of budget 2022. There are still supports and increases there as well, but we're not seeing the same kind of massive focus on the healthcare system that we have previously. That's not to say it's not important to the government, but it's just a bit of a shift in focus in where they're spending their time when it comes to some of this. All right, so let's start off with recovery. So British Columbia experienced a lot of natural disasters last year. So extreme weather events throughout 21 really put a wrench into the lives of people, the livelihoods of people, and also government support that's required for those folks. So the province has pledged about $2 billion over 3 years for recovery efforts. They have also received assurance last December, if you'll recall, from the federal government, which is supposed to contribute about $5 billion, but that has not been confirmed and it's not accounted for in the budget. British Columbia is expecting to receive some federal support just in terms of obviously the damage that was done and the effect on Canadian supply chains and the economy, but that has not been received yet. $925 million of the provincial money that's being invested over the next 3 years is going to come in this fiscal year. So that'll be fast flowing money into the economy, and most of it being spent on flood recovery. When we get into the pandemic recovery investments that were made, again, not the same massive influxes of healthcare spending that we've seen before, though they do allocate $875 million for pandemic recovery contingencies, and contingencies being if we have another wave, God forbid, or enter into a situation where the government does need to spend more money than they're anticipating on pandemic recovery. And then I'd say the third sort of plank of recovery that's really important to focus on is the Stronger BC Economic Plan. This was released last week, which charts a path for an inclusive and clean economy in BC. Is a document that includes a lot of really significant investments that we see it reflected in Budget 2022. Perhaps I think the most significant of those being the $137 billion for a new trades and technology complex at BCIT's main campus in Burnaby. That's a huge commitment there. The government's also going to spend $50 million to fund the Stronger BC investments. So the actual act of making sure that all of the strategies presented in the plan are carried out. There's $25 million for tourism to support the tourism sector, about $200 million going to Genome BC and the Michael Smith Health Research BC. We have $67 million for job training initiatives, as well as $289 million over 3 years for connectivity. They also introduced as part of this a new workforce, basically saying that they want to help equip British Columbians for the jobs of tomorrow. Interestingly enough, the province of British Columbia is expected to have about 1 million new job opportunities in the province by 2031. So there is a focus from the government in terms of what kinds of skills do British Columbians need to thrive in that new economy, and what kinds of skills should we be attracting and fostering as the next generation enters the workforce. Climate is a huge priority for this government. It's also a huge priority in this budget. You don't just see explicit supports of climate, but supports through infrastructure funding, program funding, through Clean BC to achieve that net zero by 2050 goal that the province has. What do we have for climate? So $1 billion of this budget has been invested to support the Clean BC roadmap to 2030. So that's a significant amount of money that's going to include enhancements to the industry fund and helping industry transition so that they can meet those goals and be a partner in achieving some of those objectives. The other thing that the government is really focused on this budget is helping communities prepare for natural disasters. So there's $210 million for the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund that has been allocated. So that's so that communities can prepare for floods, fires, extreme weather events that have really torn a lot of communities in British Columbia apart from the past year. A significant change as well in terms of mitigating some of those natural events is $243 million for year-round funding for wildlife services. So wildlife services will now have sustainable funding throughout the year so they can better confront those weather events and help the communities within which they serve. The government also has $83 million allocated for the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy, which they'll continue to do. Also developing a clean transportation action plan, again, focusing on making investments in infrastructure that have clean growth at the core of them. And as well through the budget, the Clean Buildings Tax Credit that encourages those retrofits that we talked about in the few slides ago in terms of tax benefits. Reconciliation. So reconciliation was also a really huge component of this budget. It's a very big priority for this government, and that is reflected in what's being outlined in Budget 2022. So we have $12 million for the Declaration Act Secretariat. So if you'll recall, a few years ago, the government adopted the UNDRIP legislation provincially, and this funding here provides funding so that the province can actually implement some of what's included in that legislation in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous communities, which is really huge. A lot of people were waiting for that and wondering when that was going to be funded. So we'll probably see more details about that in the coming weeks. It was something that they mentioned in the throne speech as well. So it is going to be a big priority for them this session and beyond. We also have $44 million for a new Ministry of Land, Water, and Resource Stewardship, which is going to have a very heavy Indigenous focus in terms of facilitating the government's reconciliation efforts with those communities. Having a sort of dedicated ministry that will focus on that will be really important. Has not been confirmation on who will lead that ministry, but there's talk that Nathan Cullen would be an excellent candidate. Further, with respect to some of the adaptation that needs to happen for the forestry community due to old growth logging deferrals, the government's going to provide $185 million to support First Nations and forestry workers. So this funding is not just for Indigenous communities, but for forestry workers generally to support that transition. Infrastructure. As I said at the beginning, the deficits that the government incurs for next fiscal year and the fiscal years leading up to 2024 are largely because they're making pretty significant investments in infrastructure. So spending is about $27.4 billion over the next 3 years. Not only is this going to support their clean growth plan and obviously help create the infrastructure needed for economic recovery to happen in the province, but it's also going to create an estimated 100,000 jobs, which is really important because obviously people need to get back to work and find ways to support their families. So that's a way in which they're stimulating growth there. As well, a lot of projects in British Columbia are built with community benefit agreements. So this is a way as well to continue to engage those communities and keep part of the labor base happy in the NDP's cohort here. There are several different commitments that they've made, including replacing the George Massey Tunnel with the Fraser River Tunnel project, which is something that's been promised for a long time. That's supposed to open in 2030. They're making pretty massive investments to transit as well. About $178 billion is what the budget will be to support clean growth in that area. They're also going to be working pretty closely with municipalities to streamline development approvals. We've got municipal elections coming up later this year. Approvals are always an area in which it makes it difficult for housing supply to be addressed quickly. If it's taking a really long time for developers to get approval, it's really hard to make more supply and make housing prices more affordable. So that's something that they might work with. David Eby, Minister for Housing, alluded to the province maybe having a greater role in this. So we'll stay tuned for more details as it relates to that. The municipal affairs budget that they've allocated for $260 million is down from last year, but that's due largely because municipalities will not be focused on the pandemic, hopefully, as much as they have been in the last few years. All right, affordability. So affordability is another theme which I'll nuance in how I describe it. So I think that the NDP really wanted to focus on affordability as a priority for this budget, but I think there's a bit of a double-edged sword because I think there's a lot of critics who would say there's not enough that's being done to address affordability. Let's start with where they've made strides, absolutely. So childcare is a huge initiative for this government, and as well because the federal government is providing support for a national childcare strategy. So the $3.2 billion deal over 5 years that British Columbia signed with the federal government is reflected in the budget. We have about $284 million coming from the province to reduce fees and support the workforce behind childcare, which by the end of 2022 is going to have an impact of reducing fees by about 50% to $20 a day. So not the $10 a day that has been promised year over year from the NDP, but inching closer to that goal. There are other affordability metrics here as well, including housing. So they've committed about $166 million to deliver on a promise to build $114,000 affordable homes. So that promise was actually made 3 years ago when Minister Robinson was in the housing portfolio. Growth in that area has been slow. It's only about a third of those homes have actually been built. So they have some catching up to do on that front, but they're going to continue to fund that initiative to try and make sure that there's affordable homes available for British Columbians. There's also clean transportation. So this is another theme that's been apparent throughout the budget. So they are providing funding for municipalities in the amount of $30 million to help with bike lanes and multi-use paths, as well as moving ahead on the Clean Transportation Action Plan to reduce the emissions in the transportation sector, as well as you'll see funding for public transit expansions in Metro Vancouver. So some additional areas that we'll touch on to focus from the budget. So healthcare, education, natural resources, social services. Again, I won't continue to draw attention to the health budget, but not as big of a focus as we've seen in past years as we exit the pandemic. Notably, though, they've announced new cancer care centers in Kamloops and Nanaimo, which is a positive development. They've provided a 6.6% increase to the forecast at $25.5 billion targeted in budget 2022. So healthcare spending still going up, not going down, still being supported. They're going to use $148 million of this to try and reduce emergency wait call times, which have obviously been an issue during the pandemic, but beyond. And they are going to also invest in some complex care homes. So for folks with mental health and addiction issues, that'll be some new infrastructure, and then $10 million more in funding to expand some of those services. They're also going to spend about $231 million over 3 years to bring healthcare workers back onto the public roster. So instead of contracting out, which happens in the current system, and this is no doubt a political move by the government to continue to create sort of good paying government jobs, delivering public services and not venturing too far into the realm of letting the private sector do too much of the work of those public services. Natural resources. So mining had a really excellent year last year, about $600 million in mining starts from last year. So that's really positive developments for the province. The government's going to spend $18 million to support sustainability and job creation in that sector, as well as support some of the reconciliation efforts that are already underway. And that includes the regulatory excellence in mining strategy and the mass timber action plan. As I mentioned before, we're getting a new ministry with the split of Ministry of Forests, of Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development. The government's going to give $44 million to that. And so that will hopefully help with Indigenous engagement and reconciliation as well. In terms of education, one of the major moves that they made from the throne speech was moving childcare back into education. So that will be under that ministry now to make sure that services are streamlined and offered to folks in a streamlined way. $664 million is going to go towards addressing the growing enrollment issues. BC had a really good year for population growth and interprovincial migration, and so schools need to be supported to help with that. $3.1 billion in capital spending, and then social service funding as well. They're going to continue the continuum of care for folks in the system until they're 27 years old, so that they're not out when they are 19. All right, just a couple more slides here before we finish off. I want to draw our attention to the political aspects of the budget. Budgets are inherently political documents. They are required by law, but they are made by political actors. And one of the things that we noticed in this budget is that it's apparent that governing is hard. So the NDP have been in government since 2017 now. They've governed through a pandemic, which has been extremely difficult. Lots of promises are made at the beginning of any government mandate, and those promises are easier said than done in a lot of ways. So that is a political implication. The electorate may start to get tired of some of the promises not being followed through on, and they might grow a little bit more impatient as the pandemic nears an end and we're not in sort of crisis mode. As well, the BC Liberal Party have new leadership with Kevin Falcon, who's a really seasoned political veteran. He's a former cabinet minister, has a lot of experience, knows what he's doing, which means the opposition is going to probably have new life breathed into it and be really strong in preparing for the next election in 2024. So the government will have that to focus on as well. I mentioned again, affordability in British Columbia is an ongoing issue. And I think that after any government has been in power for several years, if people are not seeing their bills go down, if they're not seeing housing affordability improve, that might be an area where the government has to face a public that's a little bit impatient in terms of why aren't some of the policies working right away. Of course, we know that these policies, there's no magic fix. And so it takes time, but that is a political aspect that folks have to focus on as well. And not just in terms of housing, but we see inflation is at 5.1%, which makes things more expensive. We don't see wage growth expanding at that same rate. So people will inevitably grow tired. And as well as competitiveness in terms of growing the economy. BC has a lot of resource trade exposed sectors. And if we're not competitive in those areas, it makes it really difficult to compete on the world stage. Last slide here, I just want to give you, before we finish off, a few next steps and takeaways that you can think about if you're a government relations professional, either a consultant or working internally at an organization. Budget is a really busy and exciting time for government, so it's important that you don't let the opportunity go to waste. So make sure that you're engaging your stakeholders, you're following up with them on what's contained in the budget, you're asking them for their feedback, what they'd like to see. Make sure you're providing that feedback and commentary in a respectful way to your government relationships and folks that you talk to within the bureaucracy. Have a dialogue and a positive back and forth with them, and also say thank you if you received something that you really wanted. And then as well, the best time to start preparing for the next budget is after this budget. So if you didn't receive everything you wanted, if you'd like to see different initiatives, make sure you take the time now to start preparing what you'd like to see and start socializing that this fall with folks in government so that you can perhaps see it included in the next budget. And of course, if you need any help with all of that, you can contact me direct. That's it for today. We're at time. If you want to connect, there's my information. If you have feedback on what was discussed today, please let me know. Again, thank you so much for attending and spending time here today. It's been great, and I will talk to you all